I would encourage your listeners to use the pandemic as almost this force that pushes us into what do people need? Not just at work, but what do people need? And so here's what we hear, and I'm sure your listeners will be nodding. You have the boomers that's saying everyone's got to get back to work. We miss those shoulders and conversations in the hallway, and your engineers for the most part, oh, you can't write code efficiently unless you're all huddled together and you need whiteboards. That is a small portion of the workforce. Now, it's the most powerful, wealthy part of the workforce. That's typically where your leaders are. But the majority of your workforce, the noses that you want to be counting, they are the millennials, they are the Gen Zs, they are the Gen Xers. And if you ask them, and we have, they do not want to come back to work if nothing has changed. The paradigm has shifted. So the conversation needs to be, what do employees need?
Welcome to the Warriors at Work show. This is Jeanie Coomber, your guide and host. This is a show for men and women in the workplace who want to move from the predictable to the potent. This is your weekly dose of inspiration with an edge. I talk with CEOs and shamans, sports marketing executives and therapists. All of us are like-minded thinkers and doers who tell stories, share wisdom, and challenge each other to have the best life possible inside and outside the office. Welcome to your Warrior Conversation. Hey, all my warriors, it's Jeanie. Thanks so much for joining me here at the Warriors at Work show. Today, I had the opportunity to speak with a transformational leader, Sarah Shin. She's a chief diversity officer. She has so much wisdom, not only around diversity, equity, and inclusion, but strategy, organizational design, business transformation, change. And she is such an interesting personality. And what we dove into in this conversation is we talked about this whole return to work initiative that all the businesses in the world are looking at right now. We talked about what good looks like, what it doesn't look like. And we also talked about it through the lens of her experience in diversity and inclusion, but also as a change agent and as someone who has a ton of experience in transformation. And we really talked about what it would look like to redefine our relationship to the paradigms that we all operate in. This is a fascinating conversation that I'm thrilled to bring to you as part of a lot of conversations I'm having this month with senior executive leaders about the return to work. Enjoy. So welcome to Warriors at Work. This is Jeanie Coomber, your guide and host on the Warriors at Work show. So I've been talking with executive leaders all month long to get my mind and my arms around what businesses are doing around the whole return to work initiative. It's meaning different things to different people in different industries. And I was delighted to bring to you a conversation with Sarah Shin, who is a Chief Diversity Officer at Cloudera. So thank you so much, Sarah, for joining me here today.
Thank you for having me. I am super excited about this.
So before we dig in, I want to set the stage, set the tone. So as a Chief Diversity Officer, I mean, you're in charge of strategy, organizational design. There's change, there's transformation, there's obviously diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I'd love for you to just take a step back. I'd love for you to describe yourself and what you do.
Ooh, start with an easy one, huh? So I would describe myself probably the way others describe me, which is probably the most unbiased way. Delivering high-powered products. I think in the world of HR, you can very quickly go into the processing part of HR. That's never been something that thrilled me and made me want to jump out of bed. But I love transformation. Like, this doesn't work. How about we do this? And then literally putting pen to paper, designing it and rolling it out, measuring it, iterating. So I've often kind of called myself a producer of products
Hmm.
that really enhance and accelerate your employee experience. So that's probably how I would describe myself. It's a product company, I think, if you're really doing it right.
Love that. A producer. Love that. So let's zoom out for a second. When I think about the business landscape and what's going on, is it, this whole return to work is front and center for everybody. To me, it's like chaos.
Mhm.
Everybody's trying to figure it out, and everybody's trying to say, well, do we redefine it? What do we do? How do we engage people? I'd love for you to share your take. When you zoom out and you're looking at the whole business landscape, I'd love for you to characterize it. And then I'd love for you to talk about your work and how you're playing into that.
Oh, it's such a great question. And you're right. It is on the tip of everybody's tongue right now. We're all talking about it. We're asking our network, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? Hand sanitizer in the bathroom, yes or no? Like, it has gotten really on a level that I don't think most white collar industries are used to working with, right?
Mhm.
I worked for a health tech company for 5 years. So I understand hospitals and shifts, and it is complicated. So two things. One, we are wading into we used to call it counting the noses in the building.
Hmm.
I mean, that's what's happening, right? We're counting noses in the building. So I think for your listeners, if you find yourself counting noses in the building, I think you're doing it wrong. I really do. Like, it's complicated. I know we have to follow either the location or the county or the region. We have to follow the laws to make sure the employees are safe and it's a workplace where people can feel like they can give their best work. But I think if we're counting noses, we're just doing it wrong. And
Mm.
so I would encourage your listeners to use the pandemic as this almost this force that pushes us into what do people need? And not just at work, but what do people need? And so here's what we hear, and I'm sure your listeners will be nodding. You have the boomers that saying everyone's got to get back to work. We miss those shoulders and conversations in the hallway. And your engineers, for the most part, oh, you can't write code efficiently unless you're all huddled together and you need whiteboards. That is a small portion of the workforce. Now, it's the most powerful, wealthy part of the workforce. That's typically where your leaders are. But the majority of your workforce, the noses that you want to be counting, they are the millennials, they are the Gen Zs, they are the Gen Xers. And if you ask them, and we have, they do not want to come back to work if nothing has changed. The paradigm has shifted. So the conversation needs to be, what do employees need? Not how many noses can we fit in the building in this new paradigm.
Mm. So let's break that down. So what are you learning? What are you hearing? And what are you putting into practice?
So a couple things. What I'm hearing is we need to listen to all of the voices, not just the voices that are speaking the loudest, which typically tend to be at the top of the organization and tend to be candidly pretty homogeneous. Just look at the numbers. So I would encourage your listeners to listen to all of the voices. We're also seeing that the younger generations, which is going to make up the bulk of the workforce, they are not hierarchical, title, salary focused. Couple reasons. There's a lot of socioeconomics to that, but they value experience. They value mission. They want to work for a company that has a purpose and a higher calling. By and large, the majority of the millennials will choose a job with less pay if there's a social calling, if there's a mission to what the company is doing. It doesn't necessarily have to be what the company is making, but it has to be important. They have to, be doing things for society and for the underserved community. So that's the new reality. Your workers are motivated by a different thing than the boomers were motivated by.
So organizationally, and as somebody who really likes transformation and change, and the position that you're in as chief diversity officer, so you have a seat at the executive table, you can really drive and steer change in the organization. What is your organization doing differently as a result of this feedback and this dialogue?
Mhm. I think one of the best things our company has done, and I can take zero credit for it, it truly is something that I've told the executives, this is your legacy. At the beginning of the pandemic, about 3 or 4 weeks in, they said, we have fatigue. And I'm not going to say Zoom fatigue because I actually love Zoom. I just think it's what's kept us all going. But they started doing every Friday, every 3 weeks, you'd have a Friday off. And then the next round, you would have a Thursday and a Friday off.
Mm.
And so in essence, you'd have a 3-day weekend, a 4-day weekend, a 5-day weekend, a 2-day weekend, a 3-day weekend. I mean, it was so generous. My husband works for a really big company and he cannot hide his jealousy over it. And they called it Unplug. And it was just that. And just imagine the whole company goes on vacation for 4 days. You come back to work refreshed and you don't have a mountain of email. There's no email. And this has been so healing. So we're not a huge company, but there is a way to just stop everything so that people can truly unplug. I think it's been fantastic.
Have you been hearing feedback that your teams are more productive as a result of that?
We have, and it has over a 96% approval rating in our surveys.
Gosh.
I mean, who gets that? It's been fantastic. So I think at the root of it, though, what people realize, it's the balance. So what do your employees need? That they answered that question. They didn't need a no meeting Friday where people could just jam out a bunch of email. They needed an actual break from all of it. And 96%.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That is incredible. Now, do you have a system where you're regularly taking the pulse and having that dialogue?
We
To
do.
ensure that you're moving in the right direction?
We do. We started with, like most companies, we started with an annual big survey, and then we would do one 6 months in. And so we started to look at what some of the bigger companies were doing. And we found that they were doing, like some of them, rhymes with Schmamazon, do a daily question a day. So if you're fortunate to be set up like that, great, you can really get the pulse. We opted for quarterly, shorter surveys where we can get a better pulse. And what we found is with all the COVID back to work and surveys and do you want to come back and how many people got a little surveyed out. So I think, as the leaders of your org, you're going to have to kind of balance what's too much and what's just enough.
I want to go back and revisit when we first connected to prepare for this conversation. You talked about the healthcare industry and you said how patient-centric, and it was a very motivating thing for you personally as a leader, and that you said, why aren't companies just more employee-centric the way that they are in the healthcare industry? I'd love for you to expand.
Yeah, so I had this amazing experience with 3 surfers, 2 of which were doctors in a startup, and they wanted to change healthcare. And so how healthcare currently is set up, at least in the US, is if you've ever had a health issue, you have to kind of go run to so many different providers, finding the medical records. That's not in our system. It's not great. And it's clear that it's centered around the insurance, right?
Yeah.
So this company that I work for wanted to bring the centeredness around the patient. And so they eliminated all of those things that we all hate about being sick in a healthcare system. And they centered it all around the person, and they call it patient-centered health. And the health outcomes are better. The costs are lower. I mean, far lower. And like I said, the outcomes are better. People get better faster when you focus on what that patient needs. And I thought, well, why can't we do this with high white collar, high tech? Why can't we focus on what does the employee need? Why don't we center it around arguably our most valuable asset? So, one of the examples I used when we chatted was Disney. Like they completely focus it on you and your experience. right? The
Mm.
cast members, they're not staff, they're cast. It's part of a show for you. I just love that feeling of thinking through everything. And if you've ever been at Disneyland, if you've had little kids, who pays that much money to spend 9 hours walking around with like two kids in a stroller on cement? And then you say,
In
that
90
was the most
degrees.
magical, happiest day of my life. They've been
So
really
true.
thoughtful about making sure your experience is what they're focusing on. So there's companies that are doing it. And I feel like white collar high tech could take a page from that.
Yeah, that was the other thing that you and I were talking about is the business organizations are set up on that factory model, very old school, it's old paradigm. And one of the things that I love that you said is that we have to evaluate what paradigm are we in and be honest in looking at ourselves as an organization. And I'd love for you to talk about that when you were going out and acknowledging we have to be employee centric, we have to do what they're asking us to do as an organization for us to grow and evolve. But what sort of self-reflections did you do as an organization to look at your own paradigm? Like, where were you in that process?
Yeah, it's such a powerful question because I think the first thing that most leaders will be faced with is no, right? If you if we're asking people to think differently, your brain literally says no. I think that's the
Mm,
normal response to change. So first of all, what I would say to your listeners is if you feel like the answer is no, or I don't want to talk about it, or that's too much, that's normal. Just feel comfortable with that response because that's the brain's normal response to change. Second, it is based on a factory model and it's completely outdated, right? You go from 9 to 5. I mean, the research is there. You can Google it, right? They figured out the maximum amount of hours people could work in a day and then still rest and not have injuries at work. But we are so far gone from that model. And again, I'm speaking about high tech because that's my kind of expertise. We're global. Most companies are global. There's no such thing as 9 to 5, right? We are around the clock. If you're a great leader, you understand that ideas don't necessarily happen between the work hours of 8
mm,
and 5 of wherever your time zone is. They happen anywhere and everywhere. And we also know that people work in bursts, right? You think, you collaborate, then you go back and you do. One of the biggest pushbacks we've heard about the open floor plan is that it's difficult to get work done. It just is. And so what I'm advocating is people and leaders and listeners think about more event-based types of work, right? So kickoffs, celebrations, brainstorming sessions, team building. Those sessions, you typically, if you really search yourself, you feel energized from because then you get to go home and you get to think about it and then you do some work and you doodle on the plane home or whatever. So I feel when you're thinking about complex, innovative work,
mm.
think about more event-based models and then let people go home and kind of do the work. And I think if you search yourself for the, except for your extreme extroverts and your extreme introverts, that is the rhythm for how creative ideation actually works, right? And I joke, for the ladies listening, I don't understand why I had to drive an hour into work to put my handbag in the drawer, take my drink and my laptop and my notes and my lip balm. And I go to like meeting room to meeting room to meeting room. And at the end of 8 hours, I put them back in my backpack and I get my handbag and I walk out to my car and then I drive home for an hour. What was that? Right?
Mm.
Like listeners think like this is not what the bulk of your employee population is going to want to do.
Talk about this whole conversation through the lens of diversity, equity, inclusion. How does that play into this?
So here's what's fascinating. So Deloitte did some beautiful work, and a woman named Julie out of Australia. This was her life's work, and Deloitte acquired her. And so here's what they found. Just some facts for your listeners. When you have 40% of the group population that are women or that present as women, the psychological safety goes up exponentially, thus encouraging and allowing more what ifs. It's safer, right? You say, what if, what if, what if? When you have a group that is more homogeneous, especially white men, they tend to approach each other with competition. Now, this is the same if you have a homogeneous group wherever you are. When there's someone in the room where the room is really diverse and you're ideating, they found that when someone's really different than you approach them with curiosity versus competition. So if you're thinking about ideating and solving hard problems, you probably want to create an environment where it's safe to think what if, right? You want others to approach you with curiosity versus competition, like, oh, I'm going to kill that idea and I'm going to really show Bob up, you also want more points of view than just 8 views of the same thing, right? And so this is how diversity can actually create a more ideative environment, a safer environment, and one that has better ideas. There's also less blind spots, right? If you think about it, if everyone has the same point of view, you are missing all of these blind spots. And so Gartner, Bain, Deloitte, HBR, it's all the same. McKinsey, the research is all exactly the same. When you have the highest performing companies, they are the most revenue generating or most successful financially. And then you look at the makeup of the diversity of thinkers. And that's what contributes to it, right? Is having that environment where it actually encourages lack of blind spots, more ideas, and more curiosity versus competition. And that's really what good DE&I looks like.
Talk about having an environment that is so rich and prime for what you're describing. We're going through an extraordinary time in our life, in our careers. There are a lot of the playbooks and a lot of the predefined structures that they're not applicable anymore. So it also makes the argument of, I love the curiosity piece too, the more diverse, the more curiosity, because I think that's in dire need. But it also plays beautifully into the generational differences, having, Gen Z, very purpose driven. You have millennials who are kind of a hybrid between a little Gen X, a little Gen Z, different perspective, different priorities. And then you have Gen X, then you have baby boomers. Like, just to have that discussion and acknowledge all of our differences is like, look, we don't know. But let's all agree, going back to your philosophy, that we're going to be surrounding the people. We're going to be people-centric. And that's what's going to drive our initiatives. That's what's going to drive our strategies and our beliefs as we're growing and evolving as an organization. Which leads me to my next question, because I'd love for you to talk about, you can talk about it through the lens of your industry or intuitively, whatever comes up for you. When you look out into the future, what do you see? What does the workplace look like?
It's a pretty fascinating exercise right now, right? And here's what I know is going to happen. The companies, the leaders that get it, that get this, right? That understand that surrounding your employees with an environment that enables the most creative, best idea wins. They are going to exponentially move ahead of those that are pounding noses in the building, right? Like, it's going to be exponential. And here's why. It's because most of the baby boomers are starting to retire. The mass of your employee population is, to your point, those younger thinkers that are motivated by different things for all of the socioeconomic reasons, but they are just motivated in a different way. And so if you want to have a workforce that's not quitting on you all the time, if you want to have an environment where the best idea wins, then there's some companies that are just going to leap ahead. They're just going to get it. And I honestly think you're going to see companies fail faster where they're not getting it.
Wow. And how would you like to influence that future?
I think the best way I feel like I can try to influence that is having conversations like this to just get listeners to be open to being uncomfortable about the thought paradigm, to understand the science behind what makes a high performing team, and what kind of doesn't, and what silences those ideas. You still need to have kind of my manager's a good manager, listens to me, pushes things out of the way that get in my way. But just being open to, we are entering a new paradigm. The
Mhm.
numbers tell it, right? Like the workforce is just, they're deciding they're not going to come back. It's the great uh, resignation.
Mm.
I don't know if you've seen the
Yes.
numbers. It's stunning. And here's what I know is true. When you're in a software organization, if you have more than 30% attrition, it's almost impossible to deliver your product on time.
Wow. Didn't
It's
know that.
impossible. You can break it down reasons why, but you have to assume that everyone's, working full time and writing code. You have 30% gone. Who's going to take that additional work? Not to mention who's going to be spending time interviewing and onboarding those new candidates. There's almost no way, the research says, you can deliver a product on time if you have that high of attrition. And we know that companies are experiencing high attrition.
Mm.
So the numbers the numbers are telling the story here. And so I think the big question is, are you going to get ahead of it and start to think differently and feel uncomfortable with it? Or are you just going to kind of like, nope, we're just going to continue to count the noses in the building? And, are you full time or hybrid? Or, I'm just encouraging people to kind of broaden their way they're looking at this.
So I'm curious if someone gets into a conversation with Sarah and
Yeah.
they are of, let's just call it the pre-COVID mentality.
Mm.
How do you influence them to perhaps evaluate the paradigm that they're in or consider a different path?
Yeah. Um, Believe it or not, I can be fairly diplomatic. It's not what my family says, but like, I think the key to kind of all sharing of ideas or coming together at this meeting point is understanding where that other person is coming from. Um, I find oftentimes when people are clinging to the old paradigm, it's typically fear based,
Hmm.
right? And hey, your listeners have big jobs and there's big money on the line, and they have shareholders, they have boards, they have the street that they're trying to manage. And this is an incredibly scary way to kind of look at the future. But I would just, I would listen to them and say, I totally hear all of that. That must be really intense. Here's what I'd love for you to consider, though, right? And just kind of nudge them closer to feeling more uncomfortable with this new paradigm. Like, we've been put in this position. This pandemic has been an incredibly horrible 19, 20 months, I don't know, we've lost count, months. But let's take the opportunity and kind of redefine what the new workplace looks like. This is an opportunity that has been given to us,
Mm.
and it's not going to be the same. It's never going to be the same again.
Mm. So I'd love to talk about Sarah for a minute. Take away your title, your role in the world. Talk to us about your journey. What are the things that you're working on for yourself?
Yeah, the pandemic has been a moment, I think, for all of us to really kind of strip it all away and think, okay, so what am I doing? I mean, clearly we all need to spend more time in nature and finding our why. But for me, what's been interesting is I've found, I think your listeners probably the same, we're incredibly fortunate to my spouse and I to have jobs where we can work from home. Incredibly fortunate to have bandwidth and a kiddo that's old enough that he's not jumping up and saying, look at my Star Wars princess costume.
Mm.
So having said all that, this pandemic has been interesting because you get to hear your partner's work voice, right? And there's been a couple jokes like, I didn't know you were a circle the wagon kind of guy, and he's not, or adopt the I's and T's. But what my spouse told me is, you're nicer and more patient with the people that you work with than you are at home with us.
Mm.
And I thought, oh God.
Oh, ouch.
Yeah. And, I did some deep thinking about it, because that's just counter, right? Like, the people that you love the most, you want to be the best to them. So I think what my takeaway is, when you're in the right place, your energy is very different. Someone told me that one time. And so the harder you have to work at making it the right place, the less energy you have at the end of the day. Right. And so what I've learned is, we can make anything work, right? We're tough. We can make anything work. But what do you have left over for you and your family? And I think that's just been this interesting realization that I'm working on, and how do I make that shift so it's not as big of a shift, so I go from my showing up as my very best patient self at work to my very best patient self at home, which is now like the same, right? Because I'm living at work.
Yes. It's the constant business. For me, it's business mode, mom mode, business mode, mom mode. Okay, what do I have on? Where am I? What room am I in? Is the lighting right? Is the light? Okay, shut off the phone. And then my family makes fun of me, because they'll often say, "Oh, that's the working mom voice."
Mhm.
So I love that. So talk to us about best practices, ideas for anybody listening right now that's like, let's pull this together. What can I take from this conversation that has been like most helpful to you as a leader, to the organization, when you think about this big conversation about return to work? So fire away.
I think the biggest thing that I want people to take away is, ask your employees. If you hire smart people, that's a curse and a blessing, right? The good news is they're smart. The bad news is they're smart. Ask them. They certainly have opinions. And so what happens is, it falls into two camps. Well, I've asked, but they didn't tell me. Well, then you have to examine whether or not it was really a safe place for them to be honest. Right. So that's, and there's techniques that you can do to create these safe spaces. So maybe you're not in the meeting, you have an outside group come in and do your surveys for you, or you can do listening circles. So ask your employees. They're smart, and they'll tell you. And if they're not telling you, then some self-examination is probably in order then.
Well, thank God, Sarah, you are doing this work in the world, and that you're on the forefront of being very focused about surrounding the people and making the changes to the strategies and the initiatives to support what the people want. I cannot wait to see what 2021 and 2022 reveals for you as a leader and for your organization. And I thank you so much for being in this conversation with me.
It's been all my pleasure. I just so appreciate the privilege to just have this conversation with you.
Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Warriors at Work show. If you are interested in learning more about what we do at the Warriors at Work show and platform, be sure to go over to my website, Jeanie Coomber, and subscribe to my monthly Warrior Playbook newsletter. I share everything that I'm up to month by month, as well as some lessons and insights that I've learned. I'm also interested in hearing any feedback you have about this conversation or future topics. So reach out to me directly on jc@jeanniecoomber.com or on LinkedIn. Be sure to tell your friends and your colleagues about this Warriors at Work conversation. Subscribe, review, and rate us. It's the best way to get this message out into the world. Be well.